Para dar início ao debate sobre o trabalho desenvolvido pelo painel internacional para o progresso social, chamo ao palco Olivier Bouin, membro e coautor do referido painel, e ainda Gustavo Cardoso e Guya Accornero, investigadores do domínio das ciências sociais. A discussão será moderada por João Caraça, consultor do Conselho de Administração da Fundação Carlos de Gulbenkian.
Estamos todos. Boa tarde. Well, let's engage in the second part of this eventful meeting. And this panel is, the title is A New Society ? So it's not an affirmation like the film we have just seen, it's a question. A new society is a new society possible? And then we have here three experts with a very good sense of things. So that's already two qualities. And well, I'll start by asking, putting an issue or a question to each of them, and then as the session will go, there will be possibility, of course, to have some questions from the audience. So I shall start with Gustavo Cardoso here on my right. One of the important things that comes out of the report is, of course, that change starts when we assimilate an idea, a new idea. So we assimilate it, and this is the beginning of change. But that's not the change by itself. For change to be accomplished and to be realized, it needs action and a collective involvement in that engagement. So we are, to that respect, we have already received a considerable lot of new ideas, and I can tell you that if you read the report, you'll have really an ample basket full of new ideas. Not all of them possible together, but some of them will be certainly possible too. And the important thing is to find a way and to get organized too. But the beginning will be to understand, to get ideas, and start this process of change. So I'll start by asking Gustavo. One of the points that this book that was there's a sort of synthesis of an overview of the whole exercise, and which is published in Portuguese with support by the foundation, right? We have some issues there, some copies. They are not probably they are not in sufficient number for everybody, but you know, the ones who will be quicker will be able to get them.
Not leaving the room.
No, but
exactly the end.
I hope that they will only be available at the end of the debate. Right? Anyway, so one of the important things is that it's an affirmation. A better society is indeed possible, and I guess that we are all here because we really share this idea. We believe that a better society is indeed possible. Because otherwise, if we wouldn't believe that a better society would be possible, we shouldn't probably take any effort to come together and listen and spend 2 hours listening to ideas. And so, for you, a better society is indeed possible. And I will ask you, how do you see the role of communication and of the main actors of communication, the media. But the communication is not only about the media. You have the individual interlocutors, the citizens, ourselves, but you have also the media, you have organized groups, and you have big institutions. How do you see the role of communication in getting a better society?
In 5 minutes?
In 5 minutes to start with. Yes.
Okay. Well, first I would like to tell you that I'm very happy to be here. I've grown a little bit older than you saw me on previously, because 3 years have passed. Same to it. But in order for us to understand really the flow of ideas is made by communication. Or let's start differently. Mm-hmm. First, and that's what we did in the IPSP, first we must acknowledge that there are problems. Without problems, there are no solutions possible. So, and this is quite important to understand this, because in our everyday life, from politics to every dimension of our everyday life, we do more in terms of the management of things rather than acknowledge the existence of problems and to have the time to look at the problems and how should we deal with them. So IPSP has that fundamental departure point, which is identify the problems, then it's possible to discuss solutions, and if there are good ideas into those solutions, it's possible to spread them. And that's the role of communication. But beyond that, I think that we must also acknowledge that our society, our current society, is shaped by the ways in which we communicate. And the big difference, you saw in my hands, during the film, a mobile phone in my hand. And actually, this is the tool that almost all of us in this room have inside our jackets, in our pockets, in our purses. And the existence of a mobile tool like this really has changed many different perspectives of our everyday life. And this is not just about the role of journalism and the fake news and all of that. No, I would argue, and I think this is something that we can also acknowledge by reading the whole series of books from IPSP and also the manifesto, that the way in which we communicate has changed the way in which we perceive how production in our societies is done. It has also changed the ways in which ownership is perceived in our societies. It has also changed the way in which we perceive even the monetization of our privacy. That means by telling a joke, I could say that nowadays I have two different salaries. One of them is from the university, and the other one is how much do my data value is perceived by the corporations like Facebook and Google, which will sell my salary to others, so that's my value. My value is what I earn, your value is what you earn. But the data is also present there. So it's also changed. It brought the commodification of privacy, or reserve if you wish to. And has also changed the way in which we distribute goods and ideas. And if I'm seeming too abstract for you, let's just think of the following. Currently, we look at having a car as a possible subscription, not an ownership, not buying a car, but doing just like in Netflix, to have a car through a subscription. Use it when we need it, don't use it when we don't need it. We could also say that, for instance, in a country like Portugal, we have a real problem because younger generations, by the use of subscription tools and the way in which they use mobile phones, etc., would be more inclined, or rather inclined, to have rental as their first option in terms of housing, rather than ownership of housing, which was something that we were taught culturally to value during the last 40 years. But the use of these tools is changing. So,
but anyway, this is not the end of communication.
No, it's not.
It's not the last word of communication.
It's a different way to communicate.
Yeah, but there will be, in the future, there will be certainly new ways of communication, new tools, which we don't know what they are.
But we are building them by the use of the available tools. And we must also acknowledge that, for instance, the idea of commentators, public opinion, like we have acknowledged and being used to see on our everyday television shows, is no longer going to be the future, because it's much more like influencers and what happens in Instagram, etc. So the whole point here is that you might say, no, the way to get these ideas to work is to put them on television. That might be true for people as old or older than I am, that is 50 above, exactly. So, but if we are talking about younger than 50, 40, 30, 20, the ideas for those people are going to be in other dimensions of communication.
Yeah.
And they will be spread differently. And we must acknowledge that, and that brings a whole lot of problems. And like Mark was saying, we have this problem of these monopolies that exist around the world, like Facebook and Google, that bring us lots of problems and issues towards the different division of the earnings for capital, for labor, and also for welfare, which is something that companies must always acknowledge their role to. And what we see is that Facebook, Google, Amazon, they don't pay taxes in the countries where they really are pushing to use the data and the different wages and the different wealth that is being produced. And so even if they pay well to their workers, which they don't, by the way, then they still would not be actually doing their role in terms of social services and contributing for a better society. So there are really issues and important issues that are in the center of the way in which we communicate, the way in which we use the tools for communication, and also in the possibility of spreading the ideas for a better society. It's been more
Very
than
good.
5
No,
minutes.
this is a good start of.
I know, I'm trying.
Now I'll turn to Guya Accornero. Another aspect of this report is that there are very many sources of worry, and in that film, for instance, we had a good start with the problem of cities, right? Cities where maybe 50% of the population or more now live, well, not really cities, but conurbations, right? Urban settlements. So I'd like you to develop a little bit the issue of cities and living and
Yeah, thank you.
how can a better world be?
Thank you, that's a good question. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to this very interesting session today. And I really like the documentary, I think, and especially the part on the cities, which is a little bit my hair in this moment. And I didn't find this part on the book, but I think there are many things on the book that also come back to this. And there is a point that is common to all the issues we are dealing with now in this documentary and in this discussion in the book. I think that it's the environmental issues. And environmental issues are especially very, very connected to the cities. Because with environment we don't mean just climate change or only climate change, only the things that are happening in the countryside, like we are seeing now in Australia, for instance, etc. But many of our environmental issues and problems are happening in the cities, and such inequalities in the cities also reflect a lot the differences of how these problems are experienced by different sectors of society. And so I think it's a very important point. And also cities are the places where many of the new experiences in democratic practices are carrying out, for instance, by social movements, by urban movements, by different actors. And so I think it's they are a very crucial point. And I think it's a very crucial point, especially from the point of view of Portugal in this moment, which is a country where the cities are in a process of very, very relevant change. In my project, and now I'm studying gentrification and touristification. Now it's called touristification, which is in changing radically the landscape of the cities and the neighborhoods, and with problem of displacement, evictions, etc. But also, if we look at the very micro level and sometimes meso level of associations and networks and social networks, and the dynamics, social network in the whole meaning, not a new social network, face to face, we see that there are also many innovations, that these changes are also introducing new resources, new cultural resources, educational resources.
But that was the point I would like to focus on. Cities have been the locus of innovation in the past. I mean, the great place, the great box where innovations have sprung, have been cities, because you had a huge concentration of people, the 3 T's, talent, technology, and tolerance, exactly. Anyway, cities have been the big drivers of innovation, but nowadays we see that cities, and especially cities in the third world, they grow, but not for they don't come out with innovation as we are used to think of innovation in. Coming from the mainstream, but they are centers of informality. People go there because that's the only place where they can get some money to survive. So how can a better world with this problem of growing up be tackled? If, for instance, until now, no one city has yet collapsed or exploded, no big city. But we don't know if there will be. Saskia Sassen was saying in the film, cities are now the frontiers, right? Where people. So how can we, in fact, manage cities?
My knowledge of global situation of the cities is not so deep as of the European cities. I know very well New York, the situation of New York, and many European cities. But I also know partially what is happening in some African cities. And for sure, what we can see is that the more expensive cities, in terms of housing, for instance, are in Africa. For instance, Rwanda is a terrible expensive city, and but this phenomenon of people arriving to the cities without any special project of innovation, etc., I think it has always happened. Also in Lisbon, it happened in the 50s and the 60s. The great movie was Verdes Anos is exactly about this. And now we see what the city is becoming in many aspects, positive and negative. So I think that there are for sure tendencies and trends that are dramatic, and these are especially, I think always the big problem is inequality. That increase and make the problems deeper, and because reducing inequalities in the cities for sure will bring more innovation and improvement and creativity and many good outputs and outcomes. I think this is the first point.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. And now I'll turn to Olivier Bouin, who is also a co-author of this book, right? You claim that we need to look for a third way. Right, so something that's not really capitalism as we have seen it until now, nor socialism as you have seen and experienced it, but a third way. And in fact, the question of power and wealth was there. How can we really redistribute wealth? Or we can also know that people will need, of course, capital or income, but the question of status socially in society is also very important, right? So how can we devise incentives to a better society?
Yeah, complex questions in 5 minutes, but
Yeah, well,
first of all,
that's why you
yeah.
you are
no,
here,
that's
right?
fine. No, that's I'm okay with that. No, to begin with, I think this third way, as Mark said in the introduction, I think we have to go beyond and move beyond, socialism, capitalism, and get into what, when you said in the film that there are basically two institutions that matter a lot, at least at the social, societal level, corporations and state. I think that's something that we need to take into account, in the sense that what Amartya said in the introduction, say what we need is not it's a better capitalism, in a sense. We need it's a powerful engine to produce wealth. But also it also produces negative externalities. Yep. Negative externalities in terms of social inequalities, in terms of environmental degradation, but also as we try to provide evidence for in the report, but also in the what we call the small book, the synthesis, like the relation between wealth and power. And so it's the impact of concentration of wealth, inducing concentration of power in society, and then having a strong impact on democratic deliberations. So basically what we need, in a sense, is to be able to put together a better capitalism, because it's really a capitalism / market economy. Market economy is the mode of coordination. Capitalism is the form of property. So they go hand in hand, in a sense, but what we need to do, in a sense, is to better market economies and better capitalism. It's the powerful engine of producing wealth. But if we want to reduce the inequalities, reduce the environmental degradation, and reduce the correlation between concentration of wealth, concentration of power, and I would say less functioning democracies that we have seen all around, and there are very powerful examples, mostly coming from the United States, but almost across the board. The importance of lobbies in government decisions is very important. So to some extent, the third way is concentrating on how to better capitalism and how to better market economies and market societies, and focusing on two main actors. One is the corporation, and the corporation is the main engine of capitalism and market economies. So what you need to do, in a sense, is to reduce the production of negative externalities by corporations. Private corporations account, even though we like a lot the what we call the third sector, like the cooperative firms and the third sector. Private companies do represent between 70 to 85% of economic societies. So we need to really address how they work. And as Mark said, and it's something that is very powerful in the chapter 6 of the whole report, and also in the synthesis, that we need to go towards more inclusive capitalism, means corporations that are more democratic. We've seen across the board that when you have a more inclusive governance of companies, not only taking into account short-term objectives of shareholders, but also including stakeholders, laborers, communities, neighbors, contractors, subcontractors, you have a sustained long-term performance. So what we need on the one hand is to work on firms, make them more democratic, and more inclusive, more green, but also still performing. And we've seen that in many economic systems, that the more inclusive they are and the less, I would say, regressive they are in terms of environment, the more productive and profitable they are on the long-term basis. And the second aspect, the second actor is the state, and the state is the main engine for redistribution. And what we argue or what we try to make forward in the book is not only to focus on the change of the welfare state and the change of redistribution from the classical Bismarckian or Beveridgean type of redistribution to something that will be more emancipating or more emancipatory, which is one thing. But what we try to also provide as not new thinking, but to put in the public realm, in the public conversation, in the public debate, is to look at what we call, in our jargon, pre-distribution, and also what I mentioned before, like in-market inequalities, those that are produced by the economic forces. So the more pre-distribution made by the state you have, and the less inequalities and environmental degradation and concentration of wealth and power you produce in the economic system, the less you need in terms of redistribution. And then redistribution can be improved, as we provide some examples in the book. But by addressing corporations and by addressing the way the state does function, I think you have a way, without waiting for the grand soir or the big revolution, you can really address some of the key issues and this triangle that we have to face now. Climate change, reducing social inequalities, and improving democratic deliberations.
Yeah, but constraining externalities that big enterprises normally are used to dwell with, to utilize, will make a tremendous roar, and probably not many states are powerful enough to attempt to start in that in that way. For instance, I remember, and you know, and we all know here, what we have watched with this issue of the Tobin tax, for instance. There is something that it seems very logical, but it never happens. So that may be a way, but it's a way also that it's full of big obstacles.
Sure. One aspect, and when we talk about like change and the dynamics of change, I think it will be at all levels of coming from the individual in your consumption and production ways of with your family, with the community, at the workplace, but at different levels of, I would say, governments like cities, regions, nations, but also international organizations. That's something that we do. We have 2 chapters in the World Report, and we do address a little bit of this. I worked for the OECD during 10 years, 20 years ago. There's a sea change in terms of understanding how now you can actually confront and regulate large multinational corporations. And to do that today, and to say that today at the OECD, is to be mainstream. 20 years ago, you were like almost a communist, but today at the OECD, it's part of the mainstream approach to that. And there was an article in Financial Times 2 days ago, 2020 may be the year of taxation of large multinationals. In a sense, they will start, the GAFA and others will start to pay taxes, because the pendulum has swung very, very, for 30 years in the same direction, in a sense. And now you have corrections. Obviously, it's difficult for local governments or for national governments, even though what we show in the book is that good policies, what we call the proof of diversity. If you have good policies implemented at the national level, you fare better than if you have wrong policies. But beyond the national level, international organizations have a role to play. And now if you look, for example, at the OECD, they start to regulate tax havens, like the Cayman Islands. Now it's over, they won't go bust. But in a sense, now you have stricter rules of the games so that you can actually implement some of it. So everything will be part of a solution. It's not like national governments or individuals or international organizations. It's what we call in the book a fluid coalition of actors. You know, actors will be from individuals to international organizations, and so we can do each and every bit. Obviously, if you look only at regulations of large corporations, it won't be enough. Or introducing new regulations to reduce lobbying in public policy decisions. Obviously, this will not be enough. It will be a continuum of changes, of change in regulations, of change in attitudes, in change of consumption patterns and production patterns that would provide the solution for answering this trio of, and it's the first time in history that we have to deal with reducing inequalities, stop environmental degradation, and improve democratic deliberation. So we need, it will be at every level of the unit in society, from the individual to the international organization, and I think it will concern not only economics, wealth and power, but also culture, communication, policy, and social aspects. It will be like all kinds of actors that will be mobilizing in order to go into the right direction.
Yes, certainly. Well, this is a debate, right? So I would welcome questions from the audience. 3 questions first, and then addressed to any of the members of the panel, of course. 3 questions, and then we'll answer, and then we'll see where we can go until 7:30. The first question will be there, and then are there more questions? The second one there, and the third one. Okay, very good. So.
Well, I would like to thank the organization. First of all, I would like to thank organization first of all for this nice evening. I shall assume that this is the only exposition that I had up to now to this kind of thinking. I'm very impressed and attracted, but I have several doubts. Let me. I read carefully the way you wrote. Repensar a sociedade and not change society, rethinking society and not changing society, which means the deep concern of your reformist pathway, that if I may say so. I understand that society is the same. We cannot change societies. Or let's say we can change society, but we cannot exclude this society and buy another one. It's impossible. Institutions, we cannot change institutions unless you have a revolution. Revolutions are the single way of changing deeply institutions. Other way, you need 20, 30 years to make changing in the constitutional law and so on. So the people, the individuals, you cannot change the world of these individuals. We are the same. You can. So as in last resort, I see from your lecture, I saw. Education. I saw you made a lot of stress on the process of changing, and the key word, if I can say so, is education. And of course, we have Pope Francis, and this is a moral figure. We can have moral banners, such as himself, or immoral banners. I would not say the name, but. And you can, by the contrast, you can move. But to my feeling is that it is too short as a process to rethink society. It's too short to base only upon process measures, process changes, and the most important of them, education. Are you forgetting politics? I don't say policy. Are you forgetting politics? That's my question.
That's the question. Thank you. Your,
Okay.
yeah,
Should we go?
your question?
Thank you for these questions and for all the subjects and themes you raised. And I was just wondering, what's the future on the international panel? No, because it will be interesting to know what is going to happen, and also if this must be like a very lively and alive text. If there are plans for discussing in different parts of society, because I guess every chapter will be like a panel of discussion, and especially with civil society and other authors and other stakers. Yeah.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to ask, we have elements from IPCC here, and we have an expert about communication. And I am a journalist, and I'm doing my PhD in climate change, and I would like to, and we heard about this is a complex question. We are living in a complex world, and the next century, I think and I believe that we have to deal with complex questions. So my question is how to communicate uncertainty, because uncertainty is one of the elements of complexity, and we are living in a changing world, and as Bouin said, we lived in a solid society, and now we are living in a liquid society. So how to deal with this communication of uncertainty? Thank you.
Very good.
So maybe
Who wants?
with the
Yeah,
first two.
you start. Yeah.
Okay. I think we would not be in disagreement at least on two things. The first one is that we are not changing societies, we are rethinking societies. What we try to provide are elements for actors, various type of actors. So we by rethinking societies, by rethinking how they function, the process of change, what would be a way to better them in a sense, we try to provide analytical elements, but also conceptual elements, but also evidence of things that have worked in different places. And it relates to my second point. I think we would agree also because it's not rethinking, in a sense, the title is rethinking societies, in a sense. What we try to, with this, it's present in Sophie's documentary about multiple modernities, in a sense. I think it's very important in a sense that you don't have like where you are and there will be a unique endpoint of the trajectory of society. You would arrive to something that would be a determined final end state of what you should accomplish or attain, in a sense. So what we try to do, in a sense, is take into account the plurality of societies. We try to rethink how they function, how do they evolve, what are the main drivers of change. Maybe where I would not agree with you is that you can change by behaviors, you can change institutions. Gradually, what we try to show, in a sense, that an institution is a very complex term. If you go back to a former Nobel Prize in economics, Douglas North, who was famous on his work about institutions. Institutions are not only formal rules of the game, not only constitutions or national regulations. They can be habits, they can be routines, they can be behaviors. There can be worldviews. So all this is, I think, important, and this does change. What we've seen when we started the panel with Marc back in 2013, what you have at the moment of the movie in 2017, and what we have now, we see a sea change. So it's not that societies are, on one dimension and static organisms. They are changing, they are evolving, and the number of actors from individuals, families, churches, corporations, governments, civil society movements, NGOs, all these are making the society move. Things that were like totally unthinkable, like maybe 6 or 7 years ago on climate change, now are things that are becoming, I would say not mainstream, but we were discussing with Marc before and say, well, it's difficult now to find climato-sceptics because we have accumulated so much evidence with IPCC and so on that now you have to take into account how to deal with that. 7 or 10 years ago, you had a lot of people who were in strong denial of the existence of things. So in a sense, what we're trying to do is rethink and not change. We try to study and analyze the forms, the evolutions, the drivers for change. Technology is one. Technology is impacting a lot of societies. On many aspects is very much concentrated on communication, but the impact of technology on work, and we have one chapter on, because as you know, part of the status you mentioned is related to work, and work to some extent is impacted by technology. So what we try to, in a sense, give as with this, which is a collection of what has been produced by social sciences over the past quarter century, is to give tools for analysis of, or analysis of societies, plural, with what are the main drivers of evolution and what could be among these possible changes, what are the ones that should be privileged. And we try to be not prescriptive in a sense and saying you should do this and you should not do that, because with very different societies there will be different paths and different possibilities to make these societies change. In some cases with constitutional changes, in some cases with decentralization of decisions at the national level. All these can be really taken into account. So what we try to show is the diversity, the need to think long-term and to think about the complexity and the globality of societies and to see what are the main drivers for change and try to figure out in these drivers for change how we can best impact the course of things. So that's, I would say, maybe we can continue discussion at a later stage, but that would be, I think, my first answer. On the second point, and I will leave you on the third one, but we are discussing, it's not, as is said in the documentary, it's not an intergovernmental panel. It was something that we actually started, the two of us, like 7 years ago now. Time flies. Then the three of us with Jean when he was in Paris, and then we had a group of 15, and then a group of 50, and then we end up with 350 scholars involved in the work of IPSP. So it was really unintended. If you don't believe in serendipity, this is something that would make you believe in serendipity, because these were discussions that we had, and we thought that at some point we should take stock, because social sciences have produced a lot. And one of the, I think, sheer value of this effort was the collaborative dimension. It is said a little bit in the documentary, and the fact that basically all the people felt we have a very nice collection of individuals from various disciplines, different parts of the world. Almost all of the people we contacted back in 2014 said yes, because they understood and they had the feeling that they need collectively as academia in social sciences and the humanities to give back something to society and to try to influence the course of things, not by changing societies, but giving the analysis, the concepts, the evidence, so that people at large and public policy makers can make better decisions. So this was an interesting, I would say, start. We don't know. We will start a new cycle sometime next year. I think it will be different from the first one, because this one is a kind of a big overview of, and I remember the first discussion, he said, well, the only criticism you had is say it's too large. But I think it was the very nature of the project. If you want to rethink societies, you cannot leave health, or you cannot leave religion, or you cannot leave work, or you cannot leave technology, or social movements, or communication, or politics, or democracies out of the thing. So we had to encompass everything, and now if we have a second cycle, I think we will concentrate on some of the aspects that we maybe thought were transversal to all these questions that you have in the 3 volumes, and maybe we have not dealt with them in enough depth, in a sense like the drivers of change or the actors of change. That's something like social movements and all type of actors that will be the driving forces for this. Technology, I think we're not enough focusing on this as a migrations. because that's reintroduces space, geography, and you need to take this into account. Digital societies and communication. And as a footnote to what you said, in one of the conclusions or one of the recommendations of the book is that we should deal with news and I would say the information system as a common good. And it should be treated as a common good, especially if you want to have like an informed public debate with informed citizens that would make at various levels of governments, from I would say municipalities to national governments, would make more informed decisions or would be able to engineer a more articulated debate. And that's something I think we need to take into account. That's more an expert, but this is a question that maybe would need further developments and thinking, and in order to not to reproduce what has been done, in a sense to give a first perspective on the complexities, the long-term, and the necessity of this understanding of how we can better societies.
Thank you. Who wants to ask, to answer
the question about uncertainty and liquid societies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have things to say, but I think Guya also, so we might just fall.
Go the other way around.
Yeah.
Okay, I will be very quick. Thank you for your questions. I wasn't in the panel and I wasn't in the book and in the documentary, so I also have a kind of external perspective and to address these questions. And that are, I also had a little bit the same questions in reading the book and in watching the documentary. The first one about politics, where is politics in this? I think the documentary ended very well with Leslie is the name, asking, okay, now we just need political will. And I think this is the big issue. I don't see institution and society as something completely unconnected, like divided by a strong boundary, and less I think is this. And we saw, especially in social movements, the relation between social movement and institutions, and also civil society organization and institution. I think it should be seen like a more flexible and like a kind of field of where many superposition exist. We have many actors that are involved in social movement and civic organization that are also part of the cities, for instance, and this was very, very strong for the city's government. So the local government is very important in this. I think is really the center of these changes. I think, and this is very well connected to the point on the cities. And we saw this during the cycle the anti-austerity cycle of protest. We saw many local governments involved closer to the social movement against austerity, against the central government. So in this case, we are in front of a cases of kind of contentious governance. We call this in this way. So I think these processes are much more, much less rigid than we are used to think. And this is, for me, is very important, because also I don't think the revolution always changes institutions. We saw this in the Arab Spring, for instance. And while many changes, for instance, at local level, are made without revolutions, and this also from Tocqueville, I think that we look at revolution like without social changes before, is also difficult that a revolution brings really changes. And so I think that, but still, I also found that we have to look more also at politics, and politics consider in this way as a continuous interactions between players and arenas different, social actors, such as civil society organizations, institutional actors, individuals, networks, formal, more informal, less informal. So it's a very, very, very difficult and complex field. And just to add as very small, I think this is connected to another point that I specifically liked in the book, and that you mentioned before about deliberative democracy. And I think it's connected, very well connected to the point on climate change. There is this author that I like a lot, John Dryzek, who said, and is a very one of the main authors in the area of deliberative democracy. And he said that climate change and environmental challenge and crisis of democracies can be solved both through the introduction and strengthening of deliberative instruments in democracy at different level. And he explains this very well. So it's not that one day to another we introduce the deliberative democracies in our parliaments and this everything is solved. But he suggests many steps to, and I think this is very important because I don't think that communication and information are in respect to climate change and all the environmental problems should be seen like a process top-down. I think that deliberative instruments can help people to be part of the solution. Because deliberation, in respect to the idea of majority-minority logic, which is always the idea that one part loses. Deliberation introduces another, a third, fourth, or fifth part, so it's a creative process, and I think this is very important for both for democracy and for environmental problems.
Could you allow me to jump? Go ahead.
No, if you want to.
No,
No, go
I'd like to jump on this because it's also if you want to have a debate between us, but I think it's
Afterwards.
No, afterwards. Okay, at dinner. No, but I very much agree with what Guya just said, and it's something that in the remarks I didn't have time to. I mentioned the level of governance, and it's also answer to the question. We try really to involve not only to do an academic work, but the first draft we put everything online. And we had a chance to collect a lot of feedback from not only academia, but also civil society organizations, NGOs, and so on. We've been able to say, well, you say that, but we have this experience here, or we have seen that functioning there. And that's something that is very important because it's part of the toolbox that we want also to, provide are powerful examples that maybe not be entirely replicable from one place to the other, but at least could be inspirational. And you could say, wait, it has worked there, but then we can adapt that in a different situation. And what we've seen, for example, is cities, especially large cities, there's a grouping called the C40, the 40th largest cities in the world. And they represent more than 800 million inhabitants, human beings, so it's quite a large group. They are really, at the decentralized level, they are producing new norms, they are producing new ways of deliberating. And like in the city of Paris, for example, now 10% of the investment budget of the city, which amounts to, last year was 250 million euros, so it's not an insignificant chunk of money, was decided arrondissement by arrondissement by citizens. So they had projects and they have to deliberate, and it's part of what, and I finish on that, it's part of this conception of what Pierre-Rosan Vallon, a French political scientist at Collège de France, called processual democracy. That's something that democracy, the institutionalized form of parliamentary or presidential democracy, you vote every 4 years or 5 years and then you work for a package. Now, this was, until 5 or 10 years ago, the mainstream understanding of how deliberative democracy should function. Now people do actually understand that at various levels of governments and even at national governments, you could have different ways of expressing your not only your interests but your views on a wide variety of subjects, and that's something that is very different from direct democracy. It's an intermediated form of democracy, but it's something that is really getting speed. And maybe here the innovators are not states, but they can be cities, they can be regions, they can be inter-regions and so on, where they're trying to experiment new norms, new ways of driving change and driving change in a way that would better societies. Pardon.
Very quickly, 4 ideas. The first one is a question, which is what is the opposite of social progress and who are the actors of that opposition? And this is something which is important because it allows us to understand the connection with politics. Because I would argue that the opposite of social progress is an unclear idea of some return to a past where things worked, where things were quite different from today, where everything, which is the idea of a golden age which doesn't exist anywhere, it has never existed. But nonetheless, that's also a powerful idea, and that connects with politics, because it might be the case, and I would argue that that is the case, that social progress and these ideas and this manifesto would not be taken and domesticated and used in formal politics by all political actors that are around. And so this is important, because it might be that the message is not to be understood by all the players, although everyone looks for social progress, but the idea of what social progress is different for different political actors. So, next in line, the idea about institutional change. And here I would argue that, different from the times where radio, television, and newspapers were the main communication tools, that today with the internet we are introducing a different playground where there are different rules for the game to be played. And this means that I would argue that today the strength of a potential institutional change is higher, because what we have is a tool that brings people together. We might not agree with their ideas, but their potential for institutional change is much higher. And this is why we are having all these kinds of discussions about fake news and propaganda and everything else, because actually there are people that get together by using a tool such as the internet or social media or whatever, but all within the use of the internet, and they are putting forward ideas about how to change the institutions that we have in our society. And this is clearly a variable that has to be acknowledged for in all kinds of discussions about these things here. Third idea about journalism, about I think that clearly it's not uncertainty that we should be talking about, probably is authenticity. How do we perceive the authentic today? Because this is not about truth or lies, is to question if the very use of communication in our everyday life and the changes that it has brought to our culture is not bringing different dimensions of authenticity to our everyday life. Let's begin by a joke to understand what I'm saying. No one would question that we have personal authenticity while looking at football matches. No one will agree, if one is one in one team and the other is on the other team, that one player hitting the other actually happened, because everyone is going to say, even if it's televised, that's not authentic. What we are seeing is not actually there. But I would argue also that the use of something like our phone cameras for our photographs and for our Instagram stories and everything else is changing our perception of what authentic is, because we never choose the first picture. We always choose the picture that shows us in the best way possible to everyone else. And so this means that actually we are introducing different dimensions of the authentic. We are no longer using just one authentic approach in our everyday life, or at least we are taking the acknowledgement that actually we have different authenticity dimensions. And that brings us a problem, because we were used to say that, look, it's on the news, it's authentic. And nowadays we can no longer say that. So there are different competing authentic approaches in our everyday life, in our screens. And if we want to discuss how that, what are the impacts of that in politics, and even on our perception of what social progress is, actually we have to bring communication to the center and the discussion about authentic. Because if we don't discuss what authentic is, we will enter a world which will remind us much more of the Cold War. That is, that we had Radio Voice of America and also Radio Moscow competing for our attention, rather than a world in which someone will say what authentic is. And that connects with education, because today what is taught in schools is not perceived as being authentic by everyone else. That is being put into question. It has been in the US, it has been in Brazil. It will happen, and is happening in some peculiar and different ways in Europe. And so actually we have to have a discussion about not truth, but what authentic is, and what is our shared perception in our societies of what authenticity is. if we want to discuss social progress. That's where I would end my comments.
Very good. These were three things.
Yes, and I talked about
said four.
I said four. Yeah, because one of the other discussion would be. And I thought that it was being too long.
Between 3 and 4.
Yeah, between 3 and 4. Well, roughly.
But I can return to it.
No, that's right. No, I just would like to go, if I mean, my position here allows me to talk about this issue of how to communicate uncertainty. Because you talked about uncertainty and complexity. And I think that these two concepts should be separated because they are very different. Uncertainty has always existed. Uncertainty is not knowing, it's ignorance. Because if we know everything, there is no uncertainty whatsoever. So uncertainty is with us. Things happen. We are always, people talk about hazard or luck or things like that, but uncertainty is a fact because it's just like this. There was a fantastic saying by a statistics professor that hazard was the hazard was the only thing that didn't o acaso. How do you say acaso in English? Hazard, yeah. Hazard is the only thing that doesn't happen by hazard, right? No. Okay, so uncertainty has to do with ignorance, our ignorance of what happens. Complexity is different. Complexity, if you look at history, there were epochs in which complexity was rampant and epochs where people didn't really very much matter with complexity. Complexity has to do with the difficulty of separating things. When you cannot separate the subject from the object, the beings from the rules, right? The subjects from the norms, then you have complexity. There's a nice sentence to capture it, which is everything is connected. And if everything is connected, we don't have intellectual tools to separate them. So that's a different thing. The normal way of dealing with uncertainty is what we call redundancy. Have several ways to go there. If one breaks down, we have another one. The way of dealing with complexity is what we call resilience, which is the capacity to deform and come back again. So I would say that how do you communicate ignorance? How do you communicate uncertainty? Yeah, just by spreading knowledge, right? Knowing, by having a process that continuously makes you search for new knowledge. That's the only way, because you will never be able to know everything, right? You know, I mean, we are limited in our physical dimensions. Anyway, how do I know it's complicated, you know, because it seems that we are very vague at the moment, and our word, everything is degraded. We don't know. Well, we never knew.
Actually, in Facebook, people write the status of a relationship as defined many times complicated.
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, you know, in fact, this is something that we continuously have to deal with it. But presently, not only the question of uncertainty is there, but also complexity. And people who like complexity studies think that the only way to overcome complexity is by inventing a new field of knowledge, a sort of new something. I wouldn't say new science, but a new something. Okay. Anyway, so it's a bit far away as well, but it's something that we engage in. Anyway, we are at the end of this session, at the end of debate. I would like to thank very much our panelists. And as a final comment, which I was intending to say, I mean, this is a very rich project, a very rich publication. Debates like these are just a part of the process, and you have to continue. And as Mark was saying, you are now in the listening mode, and looking forward to phase 2, and we all certainly feel enriched because we have got some new ideas, certainly, but this is a process. We have to go on and be able to go further. You have to think and then act. But as the journalist said in the film, inform first ourselves and then go and do something. One of the things, as a final comment, I don't know if it is really true, but which was very interesting, was this idea that this was the end of the do-it-yourself. Well, maybe not for everything, right? But in society, it certainly is. It's the end of the do-it-yourself. The other thing very important is this notion of knowledge, of the ignorance, of knowledge, of information, and of communicating information. This is really a huge business in today's world. It has been captured already by big corporations. A big part of the infrastructure of this communication. So it is very expensive as well. So we have to be aware of this. And the other issue that stays with us is this issue with inequality. We have to balance diversity with inequality somehow. And we have not been able to do that. And we'll have to do it. It's very good to be diverse, but unequal has a moral charge, which really brings us conflict. And because when people are very unequal, they present themselves and they rebel. So anyway, I'd like to thank you for your presence. I'd like you to thank you very much for your participation in this project in the making, right? And I hope we'll be here for the next round of discussions that we'll certainly engage in. Thank you.